Every morning at exactly 6:15, an old man walked into our diner, sat at table 7, and ordered the same breakfast. Most people never noticed him. I did. My name is Grace Sullivan, and for nearly 3 years, that quiet routine became a small part of my life. At the time, I never imagined that one simple act of kindness would lead to a day that changed everything. The diner sat on the edge of a small town in Ohio, right off Highway 23. It wasn't fancy. The red booths were worn from decades of use. The coffee machine hummed constantly, and the smell of bacon seemed permanently woven into the walls. I had worked there since I was 24. By 31, I knew most of our regular customers by name, favorite order, and preferred seat. Walter Bennett was no exception. Every morning, rain or shine, summer heat or winter snow, Walter arrived wearing the same faded brown coat and carrying the same weathered newspaper tucked under his arm. He would walk slowly to table 7 near the front window, settle into the booth, and wait patiently for me to bring his breakfast. 2 scrambled eggs, wheat toast, black coffee, nothing more, nothing less. "Good morning, Walter," I would say. "Morning, Grace," he always replied with a gentle smile. That smile was one of the warmest things about my day. Walter wasn't much of a talker, but over time, we developed our own quiet friendship. Some mornings he would comment on the weather. Other mornings he would ask how my mother was doing. My mother had been dealing with health problems for several years, and Walter somehow always remembered the details. Most people barely listened when I talked about her. Walter always listened. Maybe that was why I paid attention to him when nobody else did. The truth was that life hadn't exactly gone according to plan for me. I worked long shifts at the diner and spent most evenings helping care for my mother. College had become impossible after my father's medical bills piled up years earlier. Dreams had a way of being postponed when responsibilities showed up, but I tried not to complain. There were plenty of people carrying heavier burdens than mine. Walter seemed to understand that without me ever needing to explain it. Sometimes he would leave a $2 tip. Sometimes $3 if business had been especially busy. Once I jokingly told him he didn't need to leave a tip every single day. He smiled and said, "Kindness deserves appreciation." I laughed at the time, not realizing how seriously he meant it. The other servers barely noticed him. To them, he was simply another elderly customer nursing a cup of coffee. A few customers occasionally seemed impatient when he walked slowly through the doorway. Some didn't even acknowledge him. Walter never appeared bothered. He treated everyone with quiet respect, even when they didn't return it. One Tuesday morning in early October, I noticed he seemed more tired than usual. The autumn sunlight filtered through the diner windows, casting long shadows across the booths. Walter stared out the window longer than normal. His coffee sat untouched for several minutes. "Everything okay today?" I asked. He looked at me and smiled. "Just thinking, Grace." "About what?" He folded his hands together. "About how quickly life passes. One day you look up and realize the things that matter aren't always the things people chase." I remember laughing softly. "That's deeper than my coffee can handle before 7 in the morning." He chuckled. For a moment, his eyes seemed distant, thoughtful, almost sad. Then he reached into his pocket, paid for breakfast, and stood to leave. Before walking out, he paused beside the table. "Never change, Grace," he said. "The world has enough people trying to be someone else." I watched him leave through the front door and disappear into the crisp fall morning. At the time, it felt like just another conversation. The next morning, table 7 was empty. I figured he was running late. By 8 o'clock, I started checking the door every few minutes. Walter never came. The following morning, the seat remained empty again. And by the 3rd day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. By the 4th morning, I found myself looking at table 7 before I even tied my apron. The booth sat empty beneath the front window, untouched and strangely out of place. It was amazing how one missing person could make an entire room feel different. The breakfast rush came and went. Farmers stopped in before work. Retirees gathered around the counter discussing local football games and weather forecasts. Coffee cups clinked against saucers. Orders moved in and out of the kitchen. Everything appeared normal. Yet every few minutes, my eyes drifted back toward Walter's seat. Around 10 o'clock, I finally asked one of our regular customers if he knew anything. Mr. Henderson had lived in town longer than almost anyone. If something happened, he usually heard about it. He frowned when I mentioned Walter. "Have not seen him in a few days," he said. "Thought maybe he was visiting family." Family. The word lingered in my mind. Walter rarely talked about relatives. In fact, over 3 years of conversations, I could only remember him mentioning a son once. The way he said it made it sound like a subject he preferred to avoid. I tried to focus on work, but concern kept creeping back into my thoughts. That afternoon, I called my mother during my break. She listened quietly while I explained why I was worried. Most people would not notice, she said gently. But you always notice people. Maybe I am overthinking it. Maybe, she replied. Or maybe kindness is simply paying attention. Her words stayed with me long after the call ended. The next morning brought more disappointment. Table 7 remained empty. By then, even some of the other servers had started noticing my concern. One of them laughed lightly while refilling sugar dispensers. Grace, he is just an old customer. He probably went on vacation. I smiled politely, but something inside me disagreed. Walter was a creature of habit. People like that did not suddenly disappear without reason. The 5th morning arrived cold and gray. Rain tapped softly against the diner windows. I arrived before sunrise and started preparing coffee stations for the breakfast crowd. Outside, the parking lot glistened beneath streetlights. Everything felt unusually quiet. At precisely 6:15, I looked toward the entrance out of pure habit. For a brief second, I expected Walter to walk through the door carrying his newspaper. Instead, a black luxury sedan pulled into the parking lot. The vehicle looked expensive enough to cost more than most homes in our town. A tall man stepped out. He appeared to be in his early 40s, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit despite the early hour. His polished shoes reflected the diner lights as he crossed the wet pavement. The moment he entered, the atmosphere shifted. He carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being important. His eyes moved across the room quickly, evaluating everything and everyone. Then they landed on me. You work here? He asked. His voice was sharp and direct. Yes, I replied. Can I help you? He pulled a photograph from his jacket pocket and placed it on the counter. My stomach tightened instantly. It was Walter. The same gentle smile. The same familiar face. Relief washed over me. At least he was alive. I know him, I said immediately. Is he okay? The man studied me for several seconds before answering. Something cold flickered behind his expression. So you are Grace. Hearing my name from a complete stranger felt unsettling. Yes. He nodded slowly. Interesting. Then he glanced toward table 7, his father's table, and a faint smile appeared on his face. It was not the warm kind of smile I had grown used to seeing from Walter. It was something else entirely. The man slid the photograph back into his pocket and continued studying me as though he were trying to solve a puzzle. Around us, the diner carried on as usual. Plates clattered in the kitchen. Coffee brewed behind the counter. A few customers glanced in our direction before returning to their breakfasts. Yet for some reason, the room suddenly felt much smaller. You know my father? He asked. Walter. I replied. Of course I know him. He comes here every morning. The man's expression tightened slightly. Came here every morning. Something about the way he corrected me made my stomach knot. Is he all right? I asked again. He ignored the question. Instead, he looked around the diner with open disapproval. His gaze lingered on the worn booths, the aging floor tiles, and the faded menu boards hanging above the counter. This place, he said quietly. This is where he spent his mornings? I did not know how to answer. Before I could respond, he walked toward table 7 and sat down in the exact spot Walter always occupied. The sight felt strangely wrong. Walter belonged there. Not this man. Not with that expensive watch and perfectly pressed suit. After a few moments, I approached the table carrying a coffee pot. Would you like some coffee? I asked. He glanced up briefly. Is that what you always did for him? Yes. And he enjoyed that. His tone carried a faint trace of amusement. I think so. I poured the coffee anyway. He took one sip before setting the cup down. My father spent years building a successful life, he said. And somehow he ended up spending his mornings sitting in a roadside diner, talking to waitresses. The comment stung more than I expected. Not because of what it said about me, but because of the disrespect hidden inside it. Walter seemed happy here, I said carefully. The man laughed softly. Several nearby customers looked over. Happy, he repeated. You think you know what made my father happy. I felt heat rising in my face, but forced myself to remain calm. Walter had always treated people with kindness. I could do the same. I only know he was always pleasant when he came in. Of course he was pleasant. The man leaned back. That is because people tend to be pleasant when someone is serving them breakfast. The words hung in the air. A few customers shifted uncomfortably. Even the older couple sitting nearby exchanged glances. The man seemed completely unaware of how rude he sounded. Or perhaps he simply did not care. "I am Brandon Bennett," he said finally. "Walter's son." Hearing the name made something click. Walter had mentioned a son once. Only once. I remembered asking if they spent much time together. Walter had paused for several seconds before changing the subject. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now I wondered why. "It is nice to meet you," I said politely. Brandon smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Interesting. My father talked about you." My heart skipped slightly. He did. More than you would expect. His eyes narrowed. "Grace this. Grace that. The wonderful waitress. The kind waitress. The hardworking waitress." He shook his head. Honestly, it became exhausting. I stood there speechless. Walter had talked about me? Why? I was just someone who served his breakfast. Brandon seemed to enjoy my confusion. He folded his hands together and glanced around the room again. "Tell me something," he said. "What exactly did you do to impress him so much?" The question caught me completely off guard. Before I could answer, Brandon's smile widened, and for the first time, I realized this conversation was not going where I expected at all. For a moment, I simply stared at Brandon, unsure whether he was being serious. The question sounded less like curiosity and more like an accusation. Around us, the morning crowd continued eating, but I could feel several people paying attention to the conversation. Brandon seemed perfectly comfortable with that. In fact, he almost appeared to enjoy having an audience. "I did not do anything," I said carefully. "Your father came in for breakfast. We talk sometimes. That is all." Brandon laughed again. It was a short, dismissive sound. "That is all," he repeated. "You expect me to believe that?" I folded my arms lightly and remained standing beside the table. Years of working in customer service had taught me how to stay calm when people became difficult. Still, something about Brandon made that unusually challenging. He spoke as if kindness always came with hidden motives. "I am telling you the truth," I said. "Walter was a good customer and a good man. I enjoyed talking to him." Brandon shook his head. "You know, that sounds exactly like something someone would say if they wanted something." The comment landed harder than I expected. Not because I cared what he thought of me, but because it revealed how little he seemed to understand his own father. Walter had spent years showing kindness without expecting anything in return. Brandon apparently could not imagine such a thing. Before I could respond, one of my regular customers approached the counter to pay his bill. Mr. Henderson glanced toward Brandon and then at me. "Everything all right, Grace?" he asked. "Everything is fine," I replied with a polite smile. Brandon watched the exchange with obvious interest. The moment Mr. Henderson left, he leaned forward slightly. "See, that is what I mean." "What do you mean?" "People like you." I frowned. "People like me?" "Small-town heroes. Everyone knows your name. Everyone thinks you are wonderful." He gestured toward the door. "My father loved that sort of thing." I felt a strange mix of confusion and frustration. The conversation seemed less about me and more about something unresolved between Brandon and Walter. "Your father was always respectful to people," I said quietly. "Maybe that is why people respected him." Brandon's jaw tightened. For the first time, I saw a genuine irritation break through his polished appearance. He looked away toward the rain-covered window. "You did not know him." "Maybe not completely." "Exactly." Several seconds passed. Then he stood and walked around the diner slowly. He studied the framed photographs on the walls, the local newspaper clippings, and the collection of community event flyers near the entrance. When he returned, he dropped a business card onto the table. The card was thick, expensive, and embossed with silver lettering. Bennett Capital Holdings. Chief Executive Officer. Brandon Bennett. The company name meant nothing to me, but judging by the confidence in his posture, it clearly meant something to him. "My father should have been spending time with people on his level," Brandon said. "Not wasting mornings here." The statement irritated me more than anything he had said so far. Walter never acted like he was better than anyone. Brandon smiled faintly. That was always his problem. I looked at him carefully then. For the first time, I began noticing how different father and son truly were. Walter listened. Brandon interrupted. Walter remembered details about other people. Brandon barely seemed interested in anyone outside himself. Walter treated strangers with warmth. Brandon treated strangers like obstacles. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Just then, Brandon's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and something shifted in his expression. The confidence remained, but underneath it appeared a trace of concern. He answered immediately and stepped several feet away. I could not hear most of the conversation, only fragments. Hospital. Doctor. This morning. Decision. When the call ended, Brandon stood motionless for a moment. Then he slipped the phone back into his pocket and turned toward me. His expression had changed completely. My father wants to see you, he said. Today. My heart skipped. Walter is in the hospital? Brandon nodded once. And apparently, out of everyone he knows, you are the person he asked for by name. For several seconds, I could not speak. The sounds of the diner seemed to fade into the background as I stared at Brandon, trying to process what he had just said. Walter wanted to see me. Out of everyone in his life, he had specifically asked for me. It did not make sense. Are you sure? I finally asked. Brandon looked almost annoyed by the question. That is exactly what the nurse said. He picked up his coat from the booth. Trust me, I was just as surprised. I glanced toward the counter where my manager was organizing receipts. Part of me felt hesitant about leaving in the middle of a shift, but another part could not ignore the concern that had been growing inside me all week. Walter had been part of my mornings for years. If he needed me, I could not pretend otherwise. Less than 30 minutes later, I found myself sitting in the passenger seat of Brandon's sedan as we drove towards St. Joseph Medical Center on the other side of town. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle. Water streaked across the windows while rows of trees passed by outside. The silence inside the vehicle felt uncomfortable. Brandon kept his attention fixed on the road. I spent most of the drive looking out the window, replaying countless conversations I had shared with Walter over the years. Small conversations. Ordinary conversations. Yet now they felt strangely important. How long has he been in the hospital? I asked eventually. Brandon did not answer immediately. 5 days. 5 days. The same amount of time Walter had been missing from the diner. A knot tightened in my chest. What happened? Heart complications. His voice remained flat. The doctors are optimistic, but he wanted to put certain things in order. Something about that answer unsettled me. It sounded less like concern and more like a business update. The hospital came into view a few minutes later. It was a large brick building surrounded by neatly trimmed landscaping and rows of parked vehicles. As we entered the lobby, I noticed several people greeting Brandon by name. He barely acknowledged them. We took an elevator to the 6th floor. The entire ride felt longer than it actually was. When the doors opened, a nurse immediately approached us. She smiled warmly when she saw me. You must be Grace. I blinked. Walter mentioned me? The nurse laughed softly. Several times. Before I could respond, she guided us down a quiet hallway. My heart beat faster with every step. When we reached the room, she stopped outside the door. He has been waiting for you. Waiting for me. The words echoed in my mind. Brandon remained several feet behind us, his expression unreadable. I slowly stepped into the room. Walter sat upright in bed near the window. The moment he saw me, his face brightened. For the first time all week, relief washed through me. He looked older than before, more tired, but the warmth in his eyes remained exactly the same. Grace, he said. There you are. I smiled despite the emotion building in my chest. You had everyone worried. Walter chuckled softly. I suppose I did. I moved closer and pulled up a chair beside the bed. For several moments, neither of us spoke. The silence felt comfortable, familiar, like countless mornings at table 7. Finally, Walter looked toward the doorway where Brandon stood watching. Then he returned his attention to me. I have something important to tell you, he said quietly. His tone immediately caught my attention. This was not casual conversation. This was something else. Something serious. Walter reached toward the bedside table and picked up a worn leather notebook. I had never seen it before. The edges were faded from years of use. He placed it carefully in my hands. What is this? I asked. Walter smiled. A record. A record of what? His eyes softened. Of every reason I never stopped believing there are still good people in this world. Then he nodded toward the notebook. And most of those pages are about you. My hands felt strangely heavy as I opened the notebook. The first page contained a date from nearly 3 years earlier, only a few weeks after Walter had started coming to the diner. Beneath the date was a short entry written in careful handwriting. Grace paid for a veteran's breakfast when she thought nobody was watching. I looked up in surprise. Walter smiled softly. Turn the page. I did. Another entry appeared. Grace spent her entire lunch break helping an elderly customer fill out insurance paperwork. Another page. Grace stayed 30 minutes after her shift ended because a frightened teenager was stranded during a snowstorm. Another page. Grace bought groceries for a woman whose card was declined. My eyes moved faster through the notebook. Page after page. Date after date. Small moments I barely remembered. Ordinary acts that had seemed insignificant at the time. Yet Walter had recorded every one of them. Why? I asked quietly. Walter leaned back against his pillow. Because people reveal who they are when they believe nobody important is watching. I glanced toward Brandon. He remained near the doorway, his expression growing darker with every page I turned. You wrote all of this? I asked. Walter nodded. Not just about you. He pointed toward the notebook. Keep going. Several pages later, I discovered entries about other people. A mechanic who repaired a widow's car without charging labor. A schoolteacher who spent her own money buying supplies for students. A firefighter who quietly visited nursing homes on weekends. The notebook was filled with stories of kindness. I spent years looking for people like that, Walter said. People who still believed character mattered. I stared at him in confusion. Why would you do that? For the first time, his smile faded slightly. He looked toward the window before answering. Because I spent most of my life surrounded by people who believed money mattered more. The room grew quiet. Even Brandon did not interrupt. Walter folded his hands. Together. Many years ago, I started a company with one desk and a borrowed phone. I worked 7 days a week. For decades, growth became my entire focus. More offices, more clients, more investments. His eyes drifted toward his son. Eventually, I succeeded beyond anything I imagined. I looked at Brandon, then back at Walter. A realization slowly began forming. Bennett Capital Holdings? Walter nodded. That was my company. I felt completely stunned. The company name on Brandon's card suddenly carried a very different meaning. Walter was not simply a retired customer from a small town. He was the founder of an enormous business. Yet none of that matched the man who sat in table 7 every morning drinking black coffee and discussing weather forecasts. Why did you never tell me? I asked. Walter laughed softly. Because I wanted people to see me, not my bank account. The answer sounded exactly like something Walter would say. After I retired, he continued, I began visiting places where status meant nothing. Diners, small businesses, community centers. I wanted to understand what kind of people still existed in the world. He paused briefly. That is how I met you. I looked down at the notebook again. Suddenly, every entry felt different. This had not been casual observation. Walter had been conducting his own quiet study of human nature. You were watching all of us? I asked. Learning, he corrected gently. Then his expression grew serious. And the more I learned, the more concerned I became. He glanced once more toward Brandon. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything spoken so far. Brandon shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Walter reached toward the bedside table and removed a sealed envelope. His hand lingered on it for several seconds before he looked directly into my eyes. There is something else you need to know, Grace, he said quietly. Something neither of us can avoid any longer. Walter held the envelope between his fingers for several moments before placing it on the blanket beside him. The room felt unusually still. Outside the window, gray clouds drifted across the afternoon sky. Somewhere down the hallway, a cart rolled past, but inside the room, nobody spoke. I looked from the envelope to Walter, unsure what he wanted me to understand. A few years ago, Walter said quietly, I began noticing something that troubled me. His eyes moved briefly toward Brandon. The company continued growing. The investments performed well. The numbers looked impressive, but every conversation seemed to revolve around profit. Brandon shifted his weight, but remained silent. Walter continued, people often assume success reveals character. In my experience, it only amplifies what was already there. He folded his hands together. Kind people become more generous. Selfish people become more selfish. The words hung heavily in the air. I could see Brandon staring at the floor. For the first time since meeting him, he seemed uncertain. Walter sighed softly. When I retired, I hoped my son would discover that lesson on his own. His expression softened. Instead, I watched him become increasingly obsessed with things that do not last. Brandon finally spoke. Dad, that is not fair. Walter looked at him calmly. Is it not? Neither man said anything for several seconds. Then Walter turned back toward me. The reason I kept that notebook was not because I was searching for perfect people. Perfect people do not exist. I was searching for evidence that integrity still mattered. I glanced down at the pages resting in my lap. The entries suddenly felt less like observations and more like reminders. Small acts, ordinary moments, choices that most people never noticed. Walter smiled faintly. You never knew I was watching. No, I admitted. I had no idea. Exactly. His smile widened slightly. That is why the notebook matters. He pointed toward it. Every story in those pages happened without expectation of reward. I felt my throat tighten unexpectedly. Growing up, my mother always taught me that character was measured by what people did when nobody was keeping score. Looking at Walter, I realized he had spent years proving that lesson to himself. He nodded toward the envelope. Inside that envelope is a copy of a decision I made 3 months ago. Brandon immediately looked up. Dad, Walter raised a hand gently. Let me finish. His voice remained calm, but there was a firmness beneath it that silenced the room. He looked directly at me. I am not asking you to do anything today. I simply want you to understand why I made the choices I did. I stared at the envelope. My heart had begun beating faster. Walter, I do not understand. You will. He smiled sadly. Sooner than you think. Brandon took a step forward. This is unnecessary. Walter turned toward him. No. What is unnecessary is pretending we have not avoided this conversation for years. The words seemed to drain the remaining confidence from Brandon's face. For the first time, I saw something beneath the arrogance. Fear. Not fear of losing money. Fear of disappointing his father. Walter's expression softened again. I never wanted wealth to become the measure of a person's value. He looked at me. That is why meeting you mattered so much. My eyes filled with emotion. I only served breakfast. Walter chuckled quietly. No, Grace. You reminded me of something I was afraid the world had forgotten. He tapped the notebook gently. That kindness still exists. Then he pushed the sealed envelope toward me. Take this home. Do not open it until tomorrow morning. I hesitated before accepting it. The envelope felt surprisingly heavy in my hands. Walter leaned back against his pillow, looking suddenly tired. Yet there was peace in his expression now. As I slipped the envelope into my purse, I noticed Brandon staring at it with an intensity that made my stomach tighten. And in that moment, I realized whatever was inside had the power to change far more than my life. I barely slept that night. The envelope remained on my kitchen table beside the notebook, untouched exactly as Walter had instructed. Every time I walked past it, curiosity pulled at me. Yet I had given him my word. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains while my coffee cooled beside me. For several minutes, I simply stared at the envelope. Then I finally opened it. Inside was a letter written in Walter's familiar handwriting along with copies of several legal documents. At first, the language seemed difficult to understand. Trusts, amendments, beneficiaries, signatures. My confusion only deepened as I continued reading. Then I reached a paragraph that made me stop breathing for a moment. Walter explained that several months earlier he had restructured a significant portion of his personal estate. He wrote that wealth should not simply reward bloodlines. It should reward character. I read the sentence 3 times before continuing. According to the documents, a charitable foundation had been established in his name. Its mission was to support hardworking individuals facing financial hardship, especially caregivers, teachers, veterans, and service workers. I smiled at that. It sounded exactly like Walter. Then I noticed another document attached behind the foundation papers. My name appeared near the bottom. My hands began trembling. Walter had appointed me to serve on the foundation's governing board. Not as an employee, not as an assistant. As one of the people responsible for helping direct its future work. I immediately assumed there had been some mistake. I had spent most of my life serving coffee and balancing bills. Why would someone trust me with such responsibility? Before I could fully process the information, my phone rang. The caller identification displayed an unfamiliar number. When I answered, a calm voice introduced himself as Walter's attorney. He informed me that a formal meeting would be held later that afternoon, with several individuals named in Walter's estate documents. My attendance was requested. Requested. The word sounded far more official than invited. By 3 o'clock, I found myself sitting inside a large conference room overlooking downtown Columbus. Everything about the building felt intimidating. Polished floors, glass walls, expensive furniture. Several people in business attire filled the room. Most appeared surprised to see me there. Brandon sat near the far end of the table. The moment our eyes met, I sensed tension. He knew why we were there. He simply did not know the details. The attorney entered carrying several folders. After greeting everyone, he began reviewing Walter's instructions. Much of the discussion involved business, holdings, and charitable commitments. Brandon appeared relaxed at first, confident, certain. Then the attorney opened another folder. The atmosphere changed immediately. He explained that Walter had personally selected members for the foundation board. Several names were announced: community leaders, educators, a retired judge. Then my name. Silence filled the room. Complete silence. I heard someone shift in their chair. Another person quietly cleared their throat. Brandon stared at the attorney as if he had misheard him. "Excuse me," he said. "Could you repeat that?" The attorney calmly repeated my appointment. Brandon looked directly at me, not with the open contempt I had seen in the diner, but with genuine disbelief. The attorney continued reading. According to Walter's written instructions, each board member had been chosen based on demonstrated integrity rather than social status, wealth, or professional rank. Then he produced one final document, a personal statement written by Walter himself. As the attorney began reading aloud, every eye in the room focused on him. The first sentence immediately captured everyone's attention. Walter had left behind one final lesson, and somehow I knew that by the time the letter ended, nothing in that room would remain quite the same. The attorney unfolded the final letter and began reading. The room fell completely silent. Every person at the table seemed to understand that these were not legal instructions anymore. These were Walter's own words. "If you are hearing this letter," the attorney read, "then I am no longer sitting at table 7 drinking coffee and watching the world hurry past. I spent most of my life building companies. People congratulated me for creating wealth. Yet the older I became, the more I realized that money is the easiest thing to measure and one of the least important things to understand." The attorney paused briefly before continuing. "Character cannot be measured by quarterly reports. It reveals itself in quiet moments when nobody is paying attention." I felt my throat tighten. The words sounded exactly like Walter. Around the room, people listened without moving. Even Brandon remained silent. Several years ago, the letter continued, I began looking for examples of integrity. I found them in places many people overlook. A teacher staying late after school, a mechanic helping a widow, a nurse comforting frightened patients, and a waitress in a small diner who treated every customer with dignity regardless of what they could offer in return. My eyes filled with tears. I stared down at my hands while the attorney continued reading. Grace Sullivan never knew she was being observed. That is precisely why her actions mattered. Kindness that expects recognition is a transaction. Kindness that expects nothing is character. Across the table, several people glanced toward me. Not with judgment, not with suspicion. Something else. Respect. The attorney turned another page. To my son Brandon, if you are listening, understand this. Everything I built was intended to create opportunity, not entitlement. Wealth is a tool. It is not an identity. The greatest disappointment of my life was realizing how often you confuse the two. Brandon lowered his eyes. The confidence that had once surrounded him seemed completely gone. I do not write those words out of anger, Walter continued. I write them out of hope, because I still believe people can change when they finally see themselves clearly. The attorney finished the final page and carefully folded the letter. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The silence carried more weight than any conversation. Eventually, Brandon stood. For a moment, I thought he might argue. Instead, he looked at me. Really looked at me for the first time since we met. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. The room seemed surprised. Honestly, so was I. Brandon took a slow breath. When I walked into that diner, I assumed I understood people. I assumed success gave me that right. His voice wavered slightly. My father spent years trying to teach me something I refused to learn. He glanced toward the letter. You learned it without any of the advantages I had. I did not know what to say. Finally, I smiled gently. Walter never gave up on you. Brandon nodded. I know. A few months later, the foundation began its work. We helped veterans transition into new careers. We supported caregivers struggling with medical expenses. We funded scholarships for hardworking students who had postponed their dreams because life demanded something else first. Every decision returned to the same question Walter taught us to ask. Not who deserves recognition. Who demonstrates character when nobody is watching. Sometimes I still sit at table 7 before my shift begins. The seat across from me remains empty, but it never feels lonely. Walter left behind far more than money or legal documents. He left behind a lesson. The people who change our lives are not always the loudest, richest, or most powerful. Sometimes they are simply the people who notice others when nobody else does. And every morning when I pour a fresh cup of coffee, I remember something Walter once told me. Kindness deserves appreciation. Back then, I thought he was talking about tips. Now I understand he was talking about life.